We are finally here at season 4 of the Most Modern Podcast, our season on sustainability. We've talked about it a lot, but it's finally here. So, this episode you're listening to is a season intro. But next week, our first guest, Gray Lee, will be on, followed by Daniel McDermott on September 9th, then Jared Friedman on September 16th. And we end the season with Elizabeth Hoover on September 23rd and Caroline Sorge on September 30th. So we hope you enjoy.
모스트 보던 팟캐스트.
One thing is also that, the need for buildings is not decreasing, especially around housing and certain infrastructure. Mm-hmm. And at the same time, the existing housing and building stock is also, it's dissolving or it's getting worse. So either it's not sustainable, it's, it's old, or it actually just needs to be improved. So there's this combined force between need for more, but also need for improvement that I think also creates this economic incentive that a lot of people have brought up in our conversations. It's just that building new things is hard, and it takes some time and energy and resources to do that.
Right.
So now might be a good opportunity to introduce our conversation today. After many weeks of finding the right people, getting interviews recorded, we have finally wrapped on the sustainability season that's coming out next week. So we thought we'd take the time, as we do in the beginning of every season, to give you a little bit of an introduction on the topic, why we chose it, what we felt were the important themes to come out of these conversations, and maybe a little preview of what you can look forward to. So this is our intro episode on sustainability.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I would say that I found all the conversations to be extremely informative. You sort of think about sustainability as this big boogeyman. Oh my God, this is responsibility that we need to accomplish, that there's a lot of issues if we don't get there. But I would say that all the conversation he's had, and I think it's very hopeful for the industry, is that it's looking forward and ways to take the challenge and actually improve the situation right now. And I think that should be hopefully uplifting and a little bit more promising than in some of the conversations that occur around the topic, because I think fear is a motivator, but it can also be a hindrance in a lot of ways. I don't know how you guys felt the tone was.
No, I felt some excitement because now I feel that it's almost the first time that we see an actual push from the cities through policies to require new buildings to follow a certain way of sustainable construction. And before, it was more for those like prime buildings, like downtown glass towers, that they need to do a LEED Plus or LEED Gold or Platinum or whatever. But now cities are making it as a policy for all the new construction, basically, to follow a certain measure so that they can reduce their carbon emissions, try to build better, try to use less energy, and make it more comfortable, because the technology is out there and the cities know. So I think it is a very good, exciting time for the industry practitioners, but it's also very frightening because now it's prime time, but like there are so many various standards and guidelines out there. So it is also a little bit of a murky area where we need clarity.
I think that's actually where it's most exciting, right? Like the diversity of the different approaches and kind of different areas that we heard from. It is a huge problem. A lot of times it seems insurmountable, but I think it's really encouraging to hear from different people how they're making an impact. And I think what excites me is not only are they making an impact, but also they're very cognizant of what the actual impact is. So it's not just fulfilling a standard or checking a box. They actually are taking kind of that one step further to say, are the standards that I'm following the right ones, and are they going to ultimately get us to where that long-term goal is?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's one concern with normalization of these sort of standards, which is that you become overly bureaucratic and that there's too much regulation. There's too much sort of responsibility. You must do this, and it becomes an encumbrance on the work that's already difficult, like building a building, making a bridge, whatever. Creating a park is not easy to do in the first place. But for instance, we talked with Liz Hauver, who's dealing with Passive House, and she's an energy designer. it's interesting because that becomes a normal process into actually the creation of the building now. You're just another consultant, which in one way is, I think as an architect, is maybe a little bit intimidating because there's already so many consultants and there's already so many requirements. At the same time, the way she talks about it is it's also another voice in the room that can actually improve the building, that can
Mm-hmm.
make it better. And I think what's also really quite exciting about a number of the conversations we had is the process is one thing, but really we're talking about the end outcome, which is a more, I guess, sustainable in the sense that we use less energy, sort of built environment, but also a better one. So a passive house should be better qualitatively than a non-passive house. So I think
Yeah,
the opportunities for space and for experience are also extremely powerful.
yeah, and that's allowed by the available data, right? The technologies that are out there, the softwares that are out there. We're now at the point where we can actually gather data, not just for the building design that we talked about on different seasons, but on its actual performance as well.
Yeah.
So, and we also learned that depending on how the building is designed and positioned in the site, how you react with the sun, how you work with the sun, the orientations of the windows, what type of windows, like all those details add up to a certain score based on how the building performs and how much carbon the building consumes. So that alone was a fascinating field for me, because now we're not just talking about creativity or some other master's kind of aesthetics. It's now the discussion is much more open, where it's not just the aesthetics. It's great, but there is an actual performance score that you need to meet, and also now the cities are requiring you to meet for new construction. So all those things needs to be considered when you're starting to design a building. So it is a new avenue, and I think it's a new opportunity for architects to think about how to also design buildings to incorporate all these performances, because you don't want to just neglect all those and just think about, if it's beautiful, it's beautiful. And it's just a new time and day and age for when we're asking for buildings to do more than just be a pleasant space.
Yeah, I mean, do you guys think that? Do you guys think we're there yet in terms of people understanding building as something that is not just a form or just an image? It's in fact something that must be operated and thus must be used. I mean, I go back to our conversation about the Olympics, where okay, you have a big platform and there might be some political messaging going on here, but this whole idea that an event should be sustainable, that it shouldn't be something that you invest a ton of energy and resources into to only use once.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that that's being trickled down into sort of the everyday sort of normal built environment?
I feel like the recent surge of like sustainability in the built environment, a lot of it comes down to you can actually start to put numbers to these things. And
Yeah.
once you do, you have something that you can control, limit, or set standards around. But I think before that, it was very tough for us to enforce these things like indoor air quality, like permeability, because we just didn't have the technology, we didn't have the standards to measure. So I think part of it is, buildings are beautiful physically in a time when seeing it is one of the only ways we can evaluate it. But now
Right.
that we can evaluate on temperature, on permeability, on all these other factors, that maybe just these standards of beauty have changed. And sustainability is, I guess, now one of these new beauty standards that not only is the Paris Olympics trying to go after, but you kind of see a lot of major companies, major brands kind of incorporate that as a part of their identity.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it's an interesting paradox, because I would say the advancement that allows us to now address sustainability is probably the advancement that also caused some of the issues that require it in the first place, which sort of means like you create one challenge, you solve that one challenge with the tools that resulted that caused it in the first place. I think that's sort of natural. That's how the world and progress works. So in that sense, I would say I am always looking for reasons to be optimistic, and I think that's one of them. I was wondering if maybe we can talk about some of the major themes that we addressed in the episodes. I think there's some, although we talked to everybody who works in their different fields and different kind of capacities, there are some overarching sort of reoccurring lessons and moments that we gain from them. And I think it would be great to discuss them before we jump into the season. I think the first one is probably the incentive structure, that nothing happens in the built environment in isolation. There needs to be a reason for why we do this. There needs to be some sort of consensus around that reason. And there needs to be a clear sort of measurable set of goals that we can reach. I think that started to get addressed here, and what I'm optimistic about is that I think that sentiment and sort of creating some kind of a moral imperative about why we need to preserve the earth is noble, but I don't think it's humanly effective. And so we start to see that these systems are adapting to create this incentive structure to allow for people to say, okay, this is something that needs to happen in my company and broadly across the industry. Is that something that also resonated with you guys?
Yeah, it was something that Gray Lee actually mentioned. Gray Lee is a environmental specialist at S&P Global, and his work involves advising not just the people who are in the built environment in construction, but advising global S&P 500 companies in terms of how they can utilize their portfolio in a more sustainable manner, meaning like focusing more on the ESG aspects of things. And his work involves, and he is at the forefront of the ESG investment realm, where they are actively looking for companies who can help other companies to offload their carbon emissions scores. So I think this carbon emission becomes more it's becoming like a commodity that you trade, and maybe it's already there. So that was some fascinating area that was interesting to hear about. But he was also saying about this variety of different guidelines and standards were making things a little bit more difficult because owners are also not sure about which guideline makes more sense because they kind of some parts they overlap, like for example LEED and passive house, for instance. Passive house is all about the building's actual performance, so what's built in the building, what type of insulations that you're using, what type of windows that you're using, all influence the performance. But LEED covers a much wider, it casts a wider net than passive house. So it talks about the livability, the comfortness, the whether you have a bicycle storage inside the building. So all those things calculated and adds up to a score. So which one is more effective for a building? And maybe for some areas, LEED might be more effective and recognized by the government. Maybe some areas, passive house, for instance. Like we also heard from Liz that passive house is now a requirement in Boston for all new construction buildings. So I think for Gray's standpoint, identifying the most clear way effectively have these companies achieve the carbon emission goals is becoming a issue, but it's becoming difficult. But for him, he also claimed that it is an exciting time where finally people are now putting now interested and focused in achieving those. So it was a great conversation to learn that.
But I think what's fascinating about the conversation with him too is that, of course, I think how you reduce your carbon footprint is the challenge, but maybe that now companies recognize that it is an imperative to reduce it because not only, like I said, of a moral imperative, but because of sort of a financial responsibility to their own stakeholders and investors. That if there are issues downstream with inclement weather or extreme heat or whatnot, that this will affect the bottom line. And so actually from a sort of capital driven incentive structure, this is also not helping. So you need to forefront that investment right now. And he was very sober about that. And I think that was quite interesting. I think he has his own personal opinions about sustainability and the need for it, but the way of addressing it is not imposing those on people. It's actually working within those existing incentive structures to make sure that people understand why this is important.
I think what's also good that we start with Gray, I think, is that he kind of provides this big picture view how investors are looking at the future. And a lot of the ways we look at, future environmental risk, investors are looking at as future financial risk. And sure, it sounds good for all these companies to be sustainable, to fulfill these standards, but at the same time, they're signaling to their shareholders that, hey, like we're de-risking our future environmental risk, whether that's like, natural, regulatory, or any other things that you might encounter in this category. And I think that dovetails well with our conversation with Dan. Dan's a greenhouse gas accountant. He's been helping companies understand, kind of intake their greenhouse gas emissions, but also strategize on how to deal with them. And I think one of the ways that we look at buildings is we see them as this huge emitter. They're clearly something that our industry has to deal with, but it very closely relates to a company's kind of overall mission, right? Like buildings are only a portion of the total kind of emissions portfolio, the environment impact portfolio that they're looking at. So it's not just, I guess, like isolated within what we do, but that's a part of a larger conversation. And you see these international standards like fair trade become these like supply chain wide standards that is applied from a consumer in one location but towards producers in another. So
Mhm.
one thing that I think is interesting that is emerging is sustainability is an increasingly global conversation. And
Right.
just because a company is like headquartered in America serving American customers doesn't mean their upstream supply chain doesn't have, higher emission producers from other countries, and they're going to be ultimately responsible for those as well.
Right.
Yeah,
Right. So
the
true.
difficulty I picked on among while talking to Dan was that understanding a life cycle of a material alone is so complicated, and in order to have a full picture, it is absolutely critical to understand where your materials are sourced from, how it gets transferred to your site, and how it's built, and then even not just there, how it's used and how it get demolished and or whether it can get reused again. So it's not. It was an eye-opening conversation for me because I, as a developer, I only focus on, and I shouldn't have, but I only focus on now like building stuff, and probably architects too. Like we only focus on building stuff, and once it's
Yeah.
built, it's off my plate or it's
Right.
for someone else. But actually, from a carbon emission and life cycle perspective, that's when that's the construction activity is when most of the carbon of the building are all kind of used, and when the emission gets maximized, and then after that we have to also track that. So it was a good conversation for me to enlarge the scope of understanding of how sustainability is can influence us and also the buildings.
Yeah, and obviously we are all educated in these conversations. That's why we have them. But
Yeah.
it's not, another thing that starts to appear is that, I mean, this is a very complex and nuanced subject. I tend to find that it gets overly simplified in the media and in just our everyday conversation, and that a lot of the work that our guests have to do is actually informing or educating the people that they work with, their collaborators, their stakeholders about not only the values of what they're proposing, but how things get done. I'm curious if there is any themes that you guys identified regarding education, regarding how to make sure people are on the same page, and then maybe sometimes even having to convince people that the way that things were done before, which, as we know, is sort of the MO in the built environment, like
Mm-hmm.
this is how we built something 500 years ago. So why should we change things? How what we did before, how we did things before, was not necessarily the best way to continue doing things moving forward.
I think two big things stood out to me. One was getting involved early on the decision making process, and then I think the second one is substantiating kind of decisions or suggestions with some sort of numerical accounting.
The
Something that kind of
evidence, yeah.
gives substance to the claim. So I think for the first one, there's we know from design that like your most impactful design decisions are always at the beginning, and it seems like for sustainability it might even come even further. So a part of the overall kind of company-wide sustainability strategy, buildings is just one small part of it, right? You might make reductions in transportation, you might make reductions elsewhere to balance out maybe your spend in buildings. And I think the second part is what we talked about kind of with Liz on Passive House and also with Jared in terms of embodied carbon tooling is, hey, the better informed a design team can be at the beginning of the design, the more they can start making those big decisions early on so they don't have to make cuts later in order to kind of meet a number or meet this standard. So the second theme that I really saw is like a lot of people, or especially customers, go into this with the overall intention, but not actually a lot of understanding or strategies in order to get to their goal. So a lot of what the guests that we've talked to have to do is one, educate the customers about the standards, like what these numbers mean, what it means to actually do something to meet those standards, but also what are the things they can do and how impactful are they, right? In order to kind of give them the evidence to help their customers make the trade-offs, makes the decisions on where they can go to meet that standard that's also optimized for what they want to achieve.
I have a good example. So like the condominium project that is finishing up, that is a passive house project I'm building in Cambridge, and now it's near completion, and now we're facing the market. So the big component of our challenge is to basically marketing how to market passive house and how to, and because we know that it's good, we know that it comes with all these comfort levels, airtight systems, better for the environment. But but they are slightly more expensive. And Liz gave us a quote of maybe 3%, 3 to 5% expensive. And that will have an impact in the sales value as well. But in order for us to promote this idea, we need and promote this idea to other projects as well, we need to have a good feedback from the market. Basically, the market, the buyers, potential buyers, acknowledging the importance of these type of new, highly sustainable buildings and and the willingness to pay a little bit more than your standard, 2x4 construction buildings. But I think we're at that point where I see it's not only us, but those kind of efforts are made by other small to mid developers as well. So hopefully, we can get the market a bit more educated and also willing to accept this change too.
Yeah, I mean, and there's a couple of things that you probably are facing in terms of headwinds. One is just the inflationary market we have right now. If you're saying, okay, pay 3 to 5% more in a low interest environment, then people are much more willing to do that. But if you're having to pay 7% on that interest on that 3 to 5%, it's going to just add up to the cost over time. And I think one thing that kept on coming up, and Libo, you addressed this, is does the math work? Like, does it pencil out in terms of not only the development cost, but also here we're talking about the actual acquisition costs. The conversation we're having here is not so dissimilar than the conversation that we've been having for the past 10 years about electric vehicles, about different types of sustainable lifestyle. Like, there's always that sort of green premium that people are accustomed to. And I think that it's important that we start to, again, push that premium, the willingness to accept that premium between someone's sort of morals and their outlook on life, as well as their actual bank account. What can they pay for? I'm curious, is there any sort of leasing strategy or marketing strategy that you guys are employing to address this, to make it more palatable?
Yeah, the green lifestyle will be one, and having a future-proof green lifestyle being one. The second one would be the actual savings in the energy costs. What we heard from Liz is that we're seeing at least a 50% decrease in energy costs in any sort of passive house design buildings. Within plus or minus 10-15% of difference, but it largely also depends on the use of that space of the user. But generally, we're looking at about a 50% reduction in energy fees. So if that person is a condo buyer, that person will be benefiting from that. And if from a developer side, if you are a long-term holder on a property, for example, if it's a rental property, then you will see an immediate benefit of it becomes, regardless of whether you pay the energy bill or you push it to the tenants, both will be happy to see a much lower energy bill having a comfortable environment.
Yeah, that's so interesting, because obviously there's downward pressure on the price from interest rates, but there's probably, in the case of passive house, there's an upward pressure on the price because of cost of energy. And that could just be because energy is more expensive, because the overall economy is experiencing increase in price. It could be because of conflict, like in Europe, people don't want to use gas because it's coming from a certain country, maybe that they disagree with. So there's these two sort of forces, and I'm sure there's others as well, that are causing at least the price to be the market to be established. And I think some of those things are not obviously in our control, but we need to acknowledge them.
The other thing that Liz mentioned, which I think was very important, was having the right team. Because although these standards were 20, 30 years old now, because there aren't many of the buildings that were built following these standards, the experience level of the team really sways the construction cost. Because, for example, if a general contractor has no experience in building any of these buildings, and all of his experience is in building the 2x4 kind of typical wood frame construction, then of course that company will add a lot of contingency amount, because they haven't done it before. There's risk. They have to learn. They have to study themselves and learn how to build them. They have to train their subs to do that. So they'll naturally have to pad the construction costs a lot for them to de-risk. And that goes to the owner. And the owner sees the bill and says, wow, like, why is this so expensive? Like, it's the same thing. And they just naturally immediately think, oh, is building passive house this much expensive, which actually it isn't. It's just a lack of experience. So having the right team,
is it a hurdle that, I mean, I generally think anytime you do something for the first time, it's going to be harder than the subsequent iterations of that. Is this a hurdle about that we need to face in terms of innovation? the first passive house or the first highly sustainable building is going to cost more than the next and the next and the next. We've seen that with every single innovation. Technology always gets cheaper over time. Is this something that we can say, okay, if you invest in this right now, it will get cheaper? Or is this a different situation because we're dealing with buildings that aren't, again, iterative products?
Well, that's why we're at an exciting moment, because you have no way out. So before, people were advertising, oh, like, yeah, building green costs more. You don't have to do that, but now you have to. Like, there's no way out
Because of policy.
The policies are requiring you to do that. Well, sure, the incentives were always there, and we need more of them. But now it's not just the incentives that's motivating the developers or the builders to go into that route. It's there is a real stick. There is a real requirement now. Like, and if you don't hit that requirement, you can no longer build. And even if you have an existing building, there is also going to be a requirement to hit a certain energy level. And if you exceed that, then you'll have to pay fines or additional taxes for that. Now I think we're at the very last moment where you can at least try to build something that is standard, like as usual. But if you don't educate yourself now, I don't think you can survive like 5 years from now or even less. So people are now like educating themselves to do that, and the market adjusts fairly quickly. So I'm very hopeful that it won't be a special practice anymore. And if that change happens, the cost will also go down, and it will become a new normal.
I think this is just like a classic like innovation curve thing,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Like 10 years ago, people were talking about sustainability, but it's a very small circle. Like the building practice was not well spread out. Like now, we get a little bit more adoption, right? Certain states are forcing it, but it's still, in the grand scheme of all construction, a pretty small minority, right? So this is kind of sustainable construction's moment of like crossing the chasm, right? How do you go from these early adopters who are willing to pay the premium, take the risk, and move it into kind of mass market? And maybe that's something we'll see in the next 5 to 10 years, right? Like as these things get proven, more people adopt them, and we might just see an optimistic possible version of the future that in the next 5 to 10 years, like 50-60% of all new construction follow some sort of sustainability standard, because it's just such a widely adopted practice. I mean, you could just look at how many companies use Revit 10 years ago versus reuse Revit now, right? Like if sustainable construction can follow that same trajectory, I think it's pretty encouraging.
Yeah. So if I was looking for a new project, and if I was at a position to advise developers, like, this is your last chance. The incentives might disappear if this becomes a norm. So when both are available, I'll just go for it.
No, it's interesting too, because I mean, one thing that needs to go unsaid is that the effects of climate change and the effects of change on the natural environment caused by the built environment they're not isolated to a certain group of people. They're felt across the board, regardless of class, especially. And I think that something I've noticed is that people are starting to really wake up to it, whether it's just sort of it's in their imagination. So they think, oh my God, the world's getting hotter. This summer is the hottest on record, or whether or not it's actually true. It's really something that's starting to take effect. One thing that I noticed when I was in Paris was that this conversation about air conditioning that was revolving mostly around the Olympic Village and the lack of air conditioning there was felt by every single person. It was 30 degrees centigrade on several days in or above in Paris. You're in buildings that are extremely old and beautiful, but aren't built for sort of ventilation, either natural ventilation or mechanical ventilation. And people are wondering, like, what are we going to do next? And what I think is particularly interesting is even the conversation within the US is very different, because, for instance, what one builds in Massachusetts in temperate climate is very different from what one builds in California in a Mediterranean climate, or in the desert climate of California, which is a completely different world. And so the other thing that starts to occur is that these conversations and these developments occur sort of broadly across the whole development and AEC community, but how you implement them and how you affect them is different depending on geography, which is not this. It's been like that forever, right? But what I think we would like to unlock with conversations like these is to say, what are the main themes and what are the main challenges that people are facing across the board, and how do we actually address them, respective of one's local sort of issues and considerations.
Yeah, I think one conversation that really brought a different perspective to that is our conversation with Caroline. Like, she takes a very humanitarian approach to her ability to deploy her design skills. So she's someone who very strongly takes climate justice as an aspect of her role as a designer. So she's not only the resiliency representative within her firm, but she also is a co-chair of several committees as well as working internationally with NGOs to make sure those most impacted by climate also have the right services to make them more resilient against a changing climate. Takes a very different angle than I think from a lot of our other conversations this season, where it's much more about business impact, individual impact, and how we can make sustainably work in the first world. But she kind of really introduces this worldwide perspective. And like Alex, you said, sustainability is something we work on very locally, but the overall impacts are global.
Yeah, and we talked about the knowledge gap and in practice and also in academics between different markets. So, for example, I come from Korea, and the general practice in Korea are almost in architecture cast in place concrete, lack of insulation. So it's usually siding just attached right on the concrete, which is a no-go when you are building here and when you are especially considering to build to a certain carbon emission standard like Passive House. So this and being a global phenomena and an issue for the global community, I think having a leader that sets the great standard, like the U.S. market, for instance, would trickle down, and I think will be influential for the other global markets by the U.S. kind of requiring other markets to follow them. So, for instance, there are these movements of the electric cars, that there are incentives out there, or they also have tariffs, additional tariffs, or import bans. If those companies don't follow these standards, then you're not allowed to work with the U.S. companies. So,
well, actually, it's Europe that's leading the way in this regard.
Oh yeah, right. You're right.
And I would say U.S. still continues to be a little bit more laissez-faire, and it depends on the political situation at the time. But it does seem Europe is the one that's really pushing forward for more sustainability. Now, I don't know what the incentive is necessarily regarding their own values. It seems to be one, Europe has a sort of history of renovating and adapting after the war, rebuilding things. So their cities and their infrastructure is much older, and that they're actually sort of have gone through this rodeo before. I think the U.S. is getting to that point where, hey, a building that was built in 1950 is already 75 years old. Like, that's time to be replaced or at least updated. And so the consequences are people are starting to feel that now. Like, the buildings that you actually go out to buy and you're saying, how am I spending this much money for this building? You're starting to say, is it really worth it? And then what's interesting then is that the downstream consequences in terms of the actual product cycle and production, mostly occurring in Asia, right? Like, those then have to follow a whole different set of guidelines and rules. But the connections between all of them are quite interesting, because, say, like your Nike, if you're building a shoe, if you're making a shoe, you might be designing it in Oregon, you might be assembling it in Vietnam, but you're trying to sell it in Berlin. And if you want to sell it in Berlin, you have to follow the EU's kind of regulations and policies. So again, the reason for this issue, sort of global development and progress, is also one of the ways that we'll get out of it, which is sort of global collaboration and progress, and working between different mediating agencies. I think the collaboration aspect is really important. And I think one thing that's challenging, to be honest, is actually communicating about sustainability, and doing it in terms that make sense to everybody and don't feel like an imposition, but also feel sort of like we're doing this together. I'm curious if you guys feel that that's something that's starting to improve in your interactions personally or through the conversations we've had so far. I mean, like, is it easier to incentivize a contractor to say, okay, let's do double pane windows instead of single pane? Is it easier to say, let's build something out of mass timber instead of concrete? I'm curious.
Well, I don't know about if it's easier or not, but it is a must. And at least there is a common goal among the people whom we talk to, and outside of my daily profession, there is a common goal to reach that citywide, statewide, and also like industry-wide. And that is quite encouraging, and that is what motivates me to also like push these things forward.
But it is a process. I think that's something that I continually think about, because you wonder about your own agency within this giant challenge. And I think your agency is being ability to, like you said, Minku, push the conversation forward. Don't give up and just, keep advancing. I mean, it's not something, it's like a tug of war. You're not going to win it by yourself. It's going to require the whole team to be on one side and kind of work at it together to create that impact.
Yeah.
I mean, Lebo, maybe, I mean, you work a lot with people, and you work with large teams on big, hairy issues. Is this something that resonates with you in your life in tech, or potentially in your previous endeavors in design too?
Yeah, I think unfortunately, the recent excitement about AI has kind of put sustainability on the back burner a little bit. But I think overall, it is one thing that I think is really important that we do get with sustainability now is that everyone is talking about it. Like we're talking about it, every company is talking about it. Across the AC kind of value stack, every single person is talking about how do I make inroads with this? How do I make differentiate myself from other people in the market by becoming better at sustainability? And I think that's probably for me the most crucial aspect of this collaboration, because we touched upon a little earlier how much education individuals have to do in order to educate people upstream and downstream about what it means to build sustainably. But kind of as more people talk about it, the less that kind of first layer of communication needs to happen, and things can happen a lot more on like, okay, now we all understand this as a baseline. What do we do about it? And the collaborative conversation can become much more tactical, much more productive. And I think for me, that's the really encouraging sign, is that it's no longer one of these things that you pick up and put down, but is an idea, something that's constantly top of mind for a lot of people doing a lot of things across our.
Can AI help us build better?
I think you, depending if you talk to a lot of AI construction tech startup founders, the answer will be a resounding yes.
We'll get there.
I mean, it's an incredibly exciting time, to be honest, in that regard. I mean, I remember Rem Koolhaas came to when I was in grad school, and he said that one thing that our generation, us, have is we have a shared mission and goal. And I think that if that's, you can look at it as a challenge or a problem or a worry, but you can also look at it as an opportunity. And I think that in that regard, it's nice because a lot of the people we talk to are working sort of behind the scenes. The work that one does in this realm is not loud. It's not sexy. It's not glamorous necessarily. It doesn't have the images attached to it that I think we associate a lot of times with sort of celebrity within the AEC field. Yet at the same time, they're all extremely passionate and extremely motivated by the work that they do. And I think that sense of purpose also is something, if you're looking for a career, as we often talk about as a sort of subtopic within our conversations, is something that you can find in this right now, because not only is there demand, so you'll get a job potentially if you're good at it, but there's also a sense of impact that you can make moving forward.
Yeah, information is out there. I think it's a matter of putting in time and actually picking up the skill sets so that you can immediately implement and make impact on the field. And there are and Liz also attested towards this comment that she learned the tools herself. There wasn't any courses available. And she is now a certified passive house consultant. And those type of certification measures, if you're looking for jobs, and if companies, also architecture companies, AEC companies, they are building sustainability teams in-house now. And most of the firms that are active in this area are doing that. So it's a new field, and that's why there is this excitement, right? Anything can happen, and you can be a part of it.
Yeah, but what's interesting. I think we talked about this sort of pioneering and kind of collection of people. They're all driven by their own curiosity. Liz talked about how she noticed that her natural environment was changing, and that in her education they weren't necessarily addressing it. So she went out there and did it herself. She grabbed that opportunity and started to take advantage of it. I think that that's something that was really uplifting too, and I think that. I just noticed that more and more people are noticing these things. Like I was with a family member, and they live in London. They just bought a house, and they noticed that their little brick townhouse is not well insulated, and in the winter they actually have to bundle up more. So it's not just in the AEC industry that we're actually talking about that. I think a lot of people are talking about it, and that conversation hopefully will propel more curiosity and more intellectual and I guess professional investment into these sort of endeavors as well. Overall, what do you guys think? I would find that all the conversations to bring out an incredible amount of nuance into the field. It's something, like I said before, can be easily painted with a broad brush, but at the same time has so much specificity and so much kind of peculiarity and so much to be understood and uncovered. I think that even our panelists, if they were to talk to one another, they would learn a lot more about what they're actually
So I think it's now we're on the second wave, like a large wave. Like there was this inception of the idea period, and now we're at the implementation stage. I feel now the cities, the companies, the industry are all motivated and scrambling to find ways, the most effective way to execute things. So as a developer too, like now I have people who I can reach out to if I have questions about sustainability. And now I know I have people who knows how to build those. So just having those contact, and of course I can't be the one who's doing everything. So having those contacts and supports, and I think I only see that part will grow, and it won't be, and it might be a challenge for someone else, but if you're in this field upfront, and if you're upfront about it, and if you just immerse yourself in this field, I think there are many ways to grow, and it is a young field still. So it's very exciting.
Green 2.0, 3.0?
Yeah, 2.0.
I would echo that kind of sentiment on excitement, because I think you see the introduction of a new function or a new role into any organization, and there's a period of time where you get to define the processes, define the standards, define how things operate, and what is the role of that position within the overall org. And I think that's the time that we're experiencing now. People can make up their own titles, they can go learn things, go after things that are not kind of set out and kind of this well-trodden path, and they get to kind of invent what the future looks like. And I think for a lot of our guests who are, I guess, what we would consider early adopters of kind of sustainability as a profession, we kind of see them doing that, not only seeking out what they think is best, but also how to put that into practice. And it'll be really interesting to see some of these best practices emerge and become standards as the next wave of folks enter the field.
No, indeed. And I think that's a great note to wrap up on for our sort of intro conversation about this season. For everyone who's listening, stay tuned over the next few weeks as we release the conversations. I think they'll be extremely interesting, and you'll hopefully be able to tie back to some of the themes that we talked about today.
Most modern.
Most modern.
Most modern.
Most modern. 모스트 포던 팟캐스트.